I'm Virginia Eskin. Mention war to me, and I think of bombs and bullets. Not music, but some of the finest music of our century has been inspired by the passions of war. We're heading off to the front lines today on A Note to You. Today, our subject is going to be war and music. And to help us thread this very complicated subject, we've invited Northeastern University professor of history, Jerry Herman. And he's also the director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at Northeastern. Now, we've heard lots of music that was written, Jerry, from other centuries. We know that Beethoven wrote that famous Wellington's
Victory.
Yeah, where he has Napoleon music and
lots of cannons.
Yeah. But what is different about our century and the way music is connected to war?
Well, at the beginning of this century, composers were, like everybody else, taken up by the romance of war. And so when the First World War broke out, you got a lot of music that represented the traditional ways in which war was thought about by musicians, in terms of glory, in terms of patriotism, and then, of course, after the war, in terms of commemorations and mourning and masses and so on. But the experience of the First World War was such a shock to European intellectuals who, by and large, joined up for the most idealistic purposes, that new elements have arisen in music about war. We're going to look at those today. We're going to look, yes, at glory and patriotism, but also at fortitude, sticking it out for the long haul, and horror. And horror is really the element that's new in 20th century warfare, because 20th century war has been so horrible.
There's always been horror in war from time immemorial, but...
Well, there were aspects of war that polite society didn't talk about before the 20th century. And the difference is that in the 20th century, because war has become so widespread, so universal, involving civilians and military personnel alike, or people close to the front and people far behind the front, that you can't hide the horror anymore. And because of that, composers, artists who in the past might have avoided that subject now are confronted with it, and therefore confront their listeners and viewers with it.
Well, let's hear one of the first examples. This is a piece by Albert Sweet. It's called The Battle of San Juan Hill. Why did that battle capture Sweet's imagination?
Well, remember, this is written after the victory in the Spanish-American War. Before the war, many Americans were opposed to it, but in the wake of the war, because it was such a fantastic victory, we had emerged onto the world stage, and so it was the final fulfillment of America's destiny. And so Americans tended to look upon this splendid little war, as Teddy Roosevelt called it, as the fulfillment, America's coming of age. You can hear the cocks crowing and the reveille and the troops massing for battle, and then the tremendous charge that made Teddy Roosevelt an instant hero and an icon for everything that a rugged American ought to be.
Well, let's hear this piece. It's called The Battle of San Juan Hill, composed by Albert Sweet. That was The Battle of San Juan Hill, written by Albert Sweet and was played by the New Columbian Brass Band. George Foreman was the conductor. And my guest today is Jerry Herman, who's professor of history at Northeastern. And we're talking about war and music. We're sort of in the glory stage of war, Jerry.
Certainly heard it in that piece.
Yes. War sounds like an active, aerobic thing to do. Our next selection, tell me something about Gustav Holst. How did he fold First World War subject matter into music?
Well, it's not so much that he folded it in. He actually wrote pieces of music during the First World War. Religious music is the way that he dealt with the subject of war. But Gustav Holst was in the process of writing the piece for which he's best known, called The Planets, between 1914 and 1916. He was trying to find a more universal, more cosmic rationale for what he saw going on in the world. The planets is an amalgam of astrology and astronomy and a variety of other things. But being a man of his time, the first part of the planets is, of course, Mars, the bringer of war. It's no accident that in 1914 he chose to put that first.
We were just listening to the Mars portion from The Planets, written by Gustav Holst, and was played by the BBC Symphony. Andrew Davis was the conductor. We're going to go next to another Englishman, Hubert Hastings Parry. And my guest, Jerry Herman, is giving us some meaningful background on what was going on in the composers' heads. And this piece that we're going to hear has a very interesting story behind it. It's a hymn called Jerusalem. Now, why did he use the words that he did?
I think what's going on here is that Parry is trying to contrast the mechanization, the mentality of Germany at the time, because the Germans were perceived as machine men, with something more noble that he perceived England as being. If you listen to the Blake text, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pasture seen, and did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills, and was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills.
So that was just a portion of the great hymn Jerusalem, by Hubert Parry. And we were listening to the St. George's Chapel Choir. Roger Judd was the organist, and Christopher Robinson was conducting. Now we're going to go to some very sort of idiosyncratic numbers, idealizing patriotism in war. Charles Ives, you don't think of as a warmonger, anything but. You think of him as against any kind of music that was routine.
Well, he wrote He Is There in 1917. He was a great supporter of Woodrow Wilson. He felt that the United States was entering the war for the highest moral purposes, and he wanted to give departing troops a kind of raucous, inspiring send-off. And so in typical Ives fashion, uniting past and present, uniting memories from his childhood with what was happening now, he sent the troops off with He Is There.
And it's beautifully sung by Samuel Ramey and accompanied by Warren Jones.
There's a time in every life when it's do or die, and a Yankee boy does his bit that we may live in a world where all may have a say. He's conscious always of his country's aim, which is liberty for all. Hip hip hooray is all he'll say as he marches to the Flanders front. That boy has sailed o'er the ocean. He is there, he is there, he is there. He's fighting for the right, but when it comes to might, he is there, he is there, he is there. As the Allies beat up all the warlords, he'll be there, and then the world will shout the battle cry of freedom. Tenting on a new campground, tenting tonight, tenting on the new campground. For it's rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
I like that. Now we're going to hear Charles Ives himself singing his next version, which he did for World War II, and he changes the words.
Yeah, he had become very depressed at the end of World War I because of the failure of Wilson's idealistic program, and he was very much of a supporter of it. But when Pearl Harbor was attacked and the United States became one of the United Nations, that got his juices up again, and the old patriotic fervor returned, and he decided to go into a studio and record a World War II version with new lyrics, hoping that it would become an anthem for the next generation of boys going over there.
There's a time in many a life when it's due to facing death, but our soldier boy will do their part, that people can live in a world where all will have a say. Their conscience always of their country's aim, which is liberty for all. Hip hip hooray, you'll hear them say as they go to the fighting front. Brave boys are now in action. They are there, they will help to free the world. They are fighting for the right, but when it comes to might, they are there, they are there, they are there. Good damn deep as the Allies beat up all of our hearts. The boys be there fighting hard, and then the world will shout the battle cry of freedom, chanting on a new campground, chanting tonight, chanting on a new campground. For it's rally round the flag of the people's new free world, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
Would you want to have Charles Ives in your house singing? Today we're looking at music that war has inspired or that went along with wartime efforts. With the help of Northeastern University history professor Jerry Herman, I'm enjoying getting to know something about a subject that I must say I had never really looked into, Jerry. If you like the program, write to us. I'd love to hear from you. The address is a note to you, care of WGBH Radio, 125 Western Avenue, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. The email address is a note to you at WGBH A Note to You is made possible by the friends and alumni of Northeastern University. Now, our next category of war music is going to be moving away from the glory phase. Once you're in the trenches, you're involved with fortitude.
Well, you have to remember that everybody thought the war would be over in 6 weeks. That was their experience in European wars earlier in the 20th century and in the 19th century.
Boutique wars.
Yeah, exactly. The French expected to be in Berlin by Christmas and then home. Well, when the war slogged into a second year and then a third year and then a fourth year, obviously it wasn't enough to simply have this kind of patriotic glory any longer. First of all, the war itself was not glorious. It was industrial. And secondly, you had to sort of put your head down and slog through. Now, in part, that was literal because trench warfare meant slogging through.
Yeah, standing in water.
Yeah, but even on the home front.
So Claude Debussy apparently was moved to respond to what you're just talking about, this idea of slogging through.
A number of his friends had been killed in the war, and so in part this is a memorial to them. But there is also we've made this sacrifice and it has to be for something, that aspect of it. And so he uses a Luther-era hymn as the basis for part of it, Ein feste Burg, a mighty fortress is our God. And this is, despite the sacrifice, we need to slog on. So, en blanc et noir, in lightness and in dark, we will triumph in the end.
So if you were listening carefully, you could make out the Luther hymn, Mighty Fortress is Our God, that Debussy had tucked into that piece. And my guest, Jerry Herman, is going to read that quote, Jerry.
Debussy later on said, the music is intended to cleanse the atmosphere of the poisonous fumes of the chorales, or rather of what the chorale represents.
The Germans.
Yes.
Well, we just heard Mark Popoff and George Vona playing that duo piano piece. We're talking about war and not bullets and bombs or uniforms. We're talking about how music gets composers upset and they respond. Our next composer is the Danish person, Carl Nielsen.
Now, Nielsen was a Dane, but he had spent considerable time in Germany, and the war really shocked him looking at it from afar. The epigram that he wrote for the Fourth Symphony, the fourth movement of which we're going to hear here, is "The whole world is disintegrating. Nationalism has become like a spiritual syphilis, and it grins out through the empty eye sockets with moronic hate."
Dueling Timpanis. It's supposed to be bullets and bombs, put into music by Carl Nielsen. It was played by the Danish Radio Symphony with Herbert Blomstedt conducting. And we're on a war trip here. Our next composer is Mark Blitzstein. And what context does this piece have, Jerry?
Well, now we're moving to World War II. Mark Blitzstein obviously is quite famous now because of Tim Robbins' movie about him, because of the Cradle Will Rock. But when the United States got involved in the Second World War, he joined up. He was a sergeant in the Army Air Corps, and he was commissioned to write a symphony for the Army Air Corps. And so the result was the Airborne Symphony. He worked very hard on it. He unfortunately allowed some of his ideology to get in the way of it, or to become involved in it, I guess I should say. And so one of the movements is called Open Up That Second Front, and that was not something that the American Army Air Corps wanted to encourage at that point because they weren't ready. He was premature in that, and they regarded it as part of his communist leanings, supporting the Soviet Union.
Like a spy.
And so though the Airborne Symphony was written for the Army Air Corps, they in fact never allowed it to be played, and it wasn't premiered until much later.
It's very, very cute. Here's the Ballad of Hurry Up.
In the Air Force, it's hurry up, and wait. Hurry up, and wait, and wait, and wait. Get the chow line, no, there's no time. From the double to the hangar, get the lead out, get the guns out, and hurry up, and stop. Hurry up, and stop. Mistake. Go back. Wrap your guns up. And wait. And wait. And wait. Little things we'd like to know. Who's the gold ring is holding up the show? Oh, weathermen, you did us dirty again. So it's sweat out, so you sweat out. That hurry up, and wait until the day when you'll say this is it. When you'll hurry again, and you'll run again, and you'll knock yourself out again. And wait, and wait, and wait. Put on your old gray undershirt, put on your long-handled drawers, your heavy socks and your sky blue electric alley heated bunny rabbit suit, your wired shoes, your fleece-lined boots, your coveralls and flying helmets and goggles and earphones attached, heavy jacket, heavy pants, and don't forget to bring out the oxygen mask and the throat flag and the parachute belts and your old knee gloves and your thick electric gloves. And the cord to connect up the electrically heated suit with.
Clear the props.
Props clear.
Everyone, battle positions. Gunners, on your toes.
Here we go.
Sorry, the mission is scrubbed. The side is retired.
Is that correct? The side is retired? Cut the engines?
That is correct. Cut your engines.
Take off your thick electric gloves and your oldie gloves. Undo your throat mic, undo your parachute belts, and then begin to start to take off your heavy jacket, your heavy pants, your flying helmet with goggles and earphones attached, your wired shoes, your fleece-lined boots, your bunny rabbit suit, your old gray undershirt, and last but not least, your long-handled drawers. And by all means, don't forget to disconnect the cord to connect up the electrically heated suit with.
Mark Blitzstein's Ballad of Hurry Up, and we're slogging through the war at this point, and that was played by the New York Symphony with Leonard Bernstein conducting. And I bet they were good friends, Blitzstein and Bernstein.
Yeah, they were, in fact. Now we're going to go back to the First World War, and we're going to look at a piece of music by and played by James Reese Europe. James Europe was one of the earliest popular African-American ragtime sort of proto-jazz band leaders. When the war clouds were gathering in the United States in 1916, he joined what was then the 15th New York Infantry, which was an all-black unit, and was asked to form a band, a military brass band, which eventually was called the Hellfighters. They were sent to Europe when the war broke out for the United States. Unfortunately, Pershing and the American commanders didn't want African-American troops fighting in American uniform, and so they were given French uniforms, and they fought as the 16th French Division. Eventually, when they were reintegrated into the American Army, they were renamed the 369th New York. But in that capacity, Jim Europe became the man who introduced these styles of music to Europeans because he went around France playing this music. This particular song, which was written in 1919, was on patrol in no man's land.
What's the time? 9, all in line. All right, boys, now take it slow. Are you ready? Steady. very good Eddie. Over the top, let's go. Quiet, quiet, else you start a riot. Keep your proper distance, follow along. Cover, mother, and when you see me hover, obey my orders and you won't go wrong. There's a minute buffer coming, look out. Hear that roar, there's one more. Stand fast, for there's a very light. Don't gasp, for to find you all right. Don't start the bumming with those hand grenades. There's a machine gun, the holy spade. Alert, gas, put on your mask. Adjust it correctly and hurry up fast. Drop, there's a rocket for the fight barrage. Down, hug the ground, close you can, don't stand. Creep and crawl, follow me, that's all. What do you hear? Nothing near, don't fear, all clear. That's the life of a stroll when you take a patrol. Out in no man's land, ain't it grand? Out in no man's land. There's a minute buffer coming, look out. Hear that roar, there's one more. Stand fast, there's a very light. Don't gasp for to find you all right. Don't start the bumming with those hand grenades. There's a machine gun, the holy spade. Alert, gas, put on your mask. Adjust it correctly and hurry up fast. Drop, there's a rocket for the Bosch barrage. Down, hug the ground, close you can, don't stand. Creep and crawl, follow me, that's all. The boys, go to it! Hey! Get the bloody boys, get 'em, stick 'em with the bayonets on the ram it on. What do you hear? Nothing near, don't fear, all clear. That's the life of a stroll when you take a patrol. Out in no man's land, ain't it grand? Out in no man's land.
That was Noble Sissel singing Jim Europe's piece that he'd written for the war, On Patrol in No Man's Land. And you could hear bombs bursting in the air there. We're examining what does war sound like in music? And my guest is Jerry Herman, who's a professor of history at Northeastern University. And he's taken on this very unwieldy subject. You think of war as being just a total waste of money and manpower. But here we are left with something that's quite illuminating. Well, we were in fortitude as one of our patterns in war. And now we're going to go to the horror of war because composers also have responded to that. And our next selection is by a Czech composer, Boguslav Martinů, and it was written about around the massacre that happened in Lidice. And what year was that, Jerry?
Well, the massacre took place in 1942. Czechoslovakia had been taken over by the Nazis. During the Second World War, there were small groups of partisans who were operating against the Nazis. The Nazis had appointed Reinhard Heydrich, who was sort of the golden boy of the SS, as the Reichsprotector, the Governor-General of Bohemian Moravia. And in the fall of 1941, there was a partisan attack, and he was seriously wounded, and he finally died in June of 1942. And in retribution for that attack, the Nazis essentially leveled and massacred the inhabitants of two towns, actually, Lidice on June 9th and 10th, and also Ležáky. And Martinů, of course, was a Czech emigre living in exile from the war. And when he heard about this was his response.
That was Bohuslav Martinů's Memorial to Lidice, played by the Czech Philharmonic with Jiří Belohlavek conducting. And our program is about war and music, and my guest is Jerry Herman. What can you tell us about Benjamin Britten's very large-scale work, the War Requiem?
Well, there were a couple of requiems written after the Second World War, one by Kabalevsky on the Soviet side, and then Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, which was composed in 1961 to celebrate the reconstruction of Coventry Cathedral, which had been destroyed in the Second World War. What's interesting about Britten's piece is that he combines, obviously, post-World War II music to commemorate the particular event of World War II, but he combines it with Wilfred Owen's World War I poetry. Owen was killed on the last day, or very near the last day, of the First World War, and so it was particularly heartbreaking, and Owen's poetry speaks to the entire century of warfare.
So Abram rose and clave the wood, and went and took the fire with him, and a knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spake and said, My father, my father, my father, behold the preparations, fire and iron. But where the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth a knife to slay some. When
That was Benjamin Britten's Orphetorium, just a portion from the Great War Requiem. And we're at the commemoration stage now of our program having to do with war. And we're going to end the program with a very interesting piece, portion of it, written by Elliot Goldenthal, and it's called Fire, Water, Paper. And it finally was composed in 1995. But my guest, Jerry Herman, told me that it took quite a few years to pull it together. And it commemorates the Vietnam War.
Yes, there's very little symphonic music about the Vietnam War, and this did take a long time. What Goldenthal tried to do was to bring together Asian elements and European and American elements in order to bring this piece to fruition, trying to give tribute to and ennoble both the American and the Asian experience in the Vietnam War.
Here's the scherzo movement. It's just a portion of the Goldenthal's big oratorio called Fire, Water, Paper, and it was played by the Pacific Symphony Orchestra with the Nan Qua Vietnamese Children's Chorus, and Carl St. Clair was the conductor. I hope you've enjoyed our very brief look at this huge subject of war and music, and we owe a great debt to our guest, Jerry Herman, who's professor of history at Northeastern University, for coming on the show and bringing all this great music.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Our engineer is Antonio Oliard-Ross. Our producer is Alan McClellan. And I'm Virginia Eskin. A Note to You is made possible by the friends and alumni of Northeastern University. It's produced by Northeastern University in cooperation with WGBH Radio, Boston.